Before I open up into this roundtable, which is very much a chance for you as the audience to ask questions and make any points that you would like to add, I just want to flag that we're joined in the roundtable with the keynotes who've already been introduced by several artists who have works in the show. So I'd just like to very quickly introduce Rose English. Lynda, we've already experienced 2 of her performances. Hannah O'Shea. Hello. Sue Richardson and Anne Bean at the end. Oh, and we also have Laure Mulvey on screen, which is where the disembodied Skype is coming from. So, so Laura is also with us. Hopefully you've all seen where the works by the artists who are taking part in the panel are throughout the show. So I just want to kind of foreground that whilst there may be comments and questions for our speakers who we've already heard from, we also have several of the artists represented in the show, and hopefully we can also bring in their works and their practices into the discussion. I'm very conscious that we are running late on time, so I was actually going to open straight up to the audience actually and ask if people had questions or comments that they wanted to make to the speakers or to the artists, or whether we do already. James. Sophia's coming with the mic.
Hello.
I know.
Can you hear me? So this is maybe this is more just something for everyone to kind of comment on. But I was thinking around Marina's talk about social reproduction, and obviously we're thinking about it in relation, perhaps like artistic practice and that sort of this space that we're all in together. But there's obviously a kind of interesting thing around like institutional practices that are maybe looking, and maybe actually Adele can sort of speak of this in terms of like the governance of the women's library and things like that. Like how do we actually maybe like prefigure, and that sort of prefigurative politics idea, the way that we actually want to act or be or sort of imagine these not even imagine, like literally prefigure our politics. So like I think of an art organisation in the Netherlands called Casco, and they actually performed the Ukuleles work where they cleaned the stairs, but it was very much about addressing this idea of the back end of the institution. Andrea Phillips at a talk I saw recently also spoke very lucidly about being more pragmatic, about unionising and organising in sort of very sort of basic ways. So maybe just sort of thinking around like these, how do we do this if we're in a very particular, or we're moving into another particular moment with like Donald Trump and things like that. And I feel like there's been a tension in all the talks today about these sort of historical practices, but also there's a sort of urgency. That maybe just comment on these types of practices, which maybe are more kind of micro sort of ways of working in common or something like that.
The practices you're talking about are all very familiar to me, and I've kind of been engaged with them over many years, particularly Casco. And I guess the kind of thing which connects between ukuleles and kind of trying to realize those practices within a small institutional framework is this question of like being reflexive about the conditions, like the form, and not just the content of production, which I guess is the kind of, in a way, sort of in some ways inverting institutional critique. So it's not just the institution commissioning artists to critique it, but itself kind of internalizing and putting it out there. There was, I think that was kind of the main thing I wanted to say, was about this reflexivity, but also I think the thing of what is the gesture of making something visible. Like an institution presents artwork and it makes it visible, it can also present itself as part of a process of, I guess, transformation, or kind of really, with Casco there's this idea of commoning, so it's always kind of in conjunction with other groups and other actors and other processes in the city and beyond, like with Adelita Husni Bey's work on squatting and like the legal situation around the occupation of space. So I guess I was kind of trying to think about in my talk whether what's the kind of political process that making visible participates in, and what kinds of processes it can trigger. What does it mean to make something visible? And does that mean affirming it, or sort of like using it as a lever to go beyond the situation where things have visibility and visibility allocated to them? So yeah, and I think going beyond involves going transversally to existing practices, or sort of in solidarity and in conjunction with practices outside the specific context of the art institution, but it's a start. Yeah.
I just wanted to mention something about sort of the continuing agency of the artists. Even, there's a tendency, we talked about this sort of like reflexive archival turn and so on, but really important to sort of like differentiate between the institutions like the one that you in your beautiful paper there alluded to, the sort of calcified power that you find in all the major institutions, both in educational institutions and art institutions, and the way that art can be emptied out of meaning, even though the artists who may be alive and kicking and happy to sort of reanimate the work or contextualise it anew or whatever. But I think that organisations that have got the capacity and got people within them who are keen to develop different types of values that are empowering ones and based on equality and so on and so forth, can think about developing different institutions, whether that's in governance or in the types of activities they might get involved in. I mean, one of the things that I'm really interested in talking to colleagues in Women's Library in the next round, and especially mobilised around the changing political landscape, is to be even more explicit in appointing art activists in residence and making that really explicit. We've had one go at it with a fantastic artist, Mandy McIntosh, who worked for a year developing really powerful, fantastic work, mining the collection, so looking at the history of zero tolerance archives in the library specifically, but working with women who are surviving violence and who've got a stake in that collection. So everyone's a winner, basically. The women are involved in archival inquiry and mining the collection. The artist is making absolutely knockout work across the city, and the collection is being interpreted by community curators. And I would just refer people to an amazing woman, Joyce Follett. I don't know if our North American sisters in the room know about her work, but she's doing work on the Steinem project, which is looking at, I'll just a second on this, but the Black Lives Matter campaign has been, one of the responses to that is to, by the far right, is to appropriate the seductive, beautiful campaigning materials of Black Lives Matter, and in an attempt to try and tell black women that in the 60s and 70s in North America, that they weren't involved in the abortion campaigns at that period, that actually it was an attempt by white women to enact a genocide on black women, to sort of say black women shouldn't procreate, they shouldn't have babies, and so on, they should have abortions and so on and so forth. So Joyce Follett's project is something that I would say is a real good exemplar for us, is about involving black women in recovering the way that they were agents in the campaigns in the 60s and 70s to ensure that women had access to abortions. They're there in the literature, they're there in the posters, they're there in the iconography of the movement and so on and so forth. So it's like an archivist, activist, art activist thing that I think we should be aiming for. Anyway, I could go on, but...
Fantastic, thanks Adele. I wondered if I could open that up to the practitioners amongst us. When I was thinking about the title of this exhibition, I just wondered if there was a sense in which sometimes you want to preserve the gesture and stop it from becoming an event as such that's in an institution or part of this potential calcification. We've got a positive accumulation or an accretion that Adele mentioned, and then we have a calcification on the other hand. Anne, you look like you're about to...
No, I was thinking when you were talking, you know, that it's really interesting, this perspective now, because you know, the art school in the late 60s, early 70s, I remember, like, visibility itself was such a conservative concept, at least amongst people who were really experimenting. And so it sort of led now to much more stealthy ways of making visibility and much more interesting ways of finding histories to situate in being recognized. But I think certainly the group of people I was involved with in that early 70s time felt that even a document was more than a radical stance could take, even a photograph, you know, that it was really down to the witnesses there at that moment, and that was the only way that you were going to be really present, really alive, really make people wake up, and not just think, I'll watch the video later, I'll read the book later, I'll look at the photo later. You know, it really made, and I think it did it, you know, and I think it's the awareness of that's leapt into how we look at archive now, and I think it's a very powerful underbelly.
Anyone else want to add to that? Rose?
I'm really very interested to hear Anne speak with such passion about documentation. I think we were making well probably at the same time. I don't remember that. It shows how multifarious positions were. It wasn't just one viewpoint. From my own perspective, there are two works here, included in this exhibition. One is Berring, both collaborative works made with Sally Potter in 1976, and the second work that's represented here is Mountain, made in 1977. And in relation to the title of this event and these exhibitions of other spaces, they both displayed different strategies about space as women artists, as young women artists. We were around 25 when we made these two pieces. The first strategy was to take back our own appropriation of space and to demand or to place ourselves in epic space, a bit like the way that women novelists have been allowed to appropriate epic space. And that was a performance that was in our house, our home, which was a squatted building, an ice rink and a swimming pool, and it was a cyclical performance. And the second was in total contrast, and it was a performance that happened as a result of an invitation to make a performance at Modern Art Oxford by a curator called Mark Francis. And for anybody now, probably this would represent a real achievement to be invited. But we, in all seriousness, discussed whether we should actually take up this invitation, or whether our work would be hopelessly compromised and appropriated by the institution that was inviting us to be there. So the performance took the form of the debate between ourselves about making this performance, and also about the work that we all put in juxtaposition with, which was an exhibition of paintings by Frank Stella that I think we were meant to just ignore and pretend weren't there. And the publication of an artist's book, which has been included in this exhibition. So those are two very different strategies, and it felt important to do the Modern Art Oxford show, because it felt like absolutely blowing open a door within which we could perhaps leave the door ajar for others to follow.
I guess I would just add that that is really what I was trying to get at by the concept of encountering, was precisely the witnessing, but also the debating, you know, it's a question of the precise context and what takes place among bodies in that context and who is witnessing it. But also I think it's important to extend that to future engagers of that material because, you know, look at this show. I mean, it becomes something different. It's a different kind of encountering. But the possibility, I mean, otherwise we wouldn't be curating or writing art histories. The possibility is for a future encountering to open up another space particular to that context and what's needed at that time. So just to throw that in.
I had the thing of never throwing pieces of paper away. I was taught by Terry Atkinson of Art and Language. He was one of the great inspirations. And so that whole sort of sense of pieces of paper as being, you know, what art was about was there already in sort of 65, 66. I did the first book as artwork show with Germano Chilant at Nigel Greenwood's in 72. You know, so I couldn't buy art, I couldn't afford to buy art, I didn't have space for it anyhow. As people today don't have space for it, but you can buy artist books. But it's a real problem now. The big archive, I found it at Newer, they've sent it to Norwich Archives and it's being digitalised, and I'm a bit worried about it. And also when I first went to Norwich, I said, let's do a collection of artist books, and they said, oh no, they're too expensive, we won't do that. And then I suggested that all staff ought to collect their invitation cards and give them to the library, and second year students could put some time in filing them once a year. And the librarian wouldn't do that because he said that would encourage students to pinch things. And now, of course, everything is digital, you know, sort of, I get less and less post, and I think that's a kind of problem. So I think we're in the midst of this little era, you know, from the late 60s through to now, where things were printed.
I think that chimes in actually very interesting what the kinds of shifts that Laure was talking about in relation to her thinking, and then it also links up Adele with the kinds of worries and concerns, very practical ones, to go back to that idea of pragmatism that seems to also be threading through. Hannah, do you want to say
yes.
something?
Yes, facilities. I think what, from my point of view and from the point of view of the people I was working with, it was, oh, you can't hear, sorry.
Perfect.
Yes, from my point of view and the point of view of people I was working with, what was important was, at that time, was the importance of working outside the institutions, and because we weren't welcome anyhow in any significant way. Apart from listening to the wise men. You know, we had to find our own practice, our own form, our own content, and this was very important. And what was not sort of said was being said by us, not only amongst ourselves, but also it began to be perhaps not acceptable, but certainly a little door was sort of squeaking open, you know, a little inch was giving. And so things that were not permissible, if you like, were beginning to be said. And I think that we had a profound, I mean, I'm talking about the women artists, we had a profound effect on what could be said and the form in which it took. And also, a lot of us were quite involved, and certainly I was, in terms of filming and performing. It was sort of breaking that barrier between the performer and the observer, the documenter,
and the power relationships between that, even if it was, women, it was sort of questioning that. And I made a few sort of pieces of work which were about that with a colleague called Jay Wibberley, where we interchanged the documentation and the performance. And so there were all those kinds of considerations going on. And of course the variety of work that was being done in, say how Sally and Rose were working, and Anne and people and other women. It was a very diverse, but there were very common strands which I felt were visible, and we were very aware of everybody, I think, of other people's work at that time, other women's work.
I wonder, Sue, if I can just bring in the postal art event in that respect. And yeah.
I was one of the founder members of the Women's Postal Art event, which was originally called Anonymous Was a Woman. It was myself, Kate Walker, Monica Ross and Philippa Goodall, I think. It is 40 years ago. I think that got together in various ways, but mainly, certainly three of us, because we'd got very young babies at the time. So we met at the baby clinic. And then we went to a women's art conference in London and met Kate Walker, who stood up in the middle of something very like this and said, aren't there any women here who just work at home and, who want to carry on doing it? And so we got together with her, and from then we started the Postal Art event, which involved not only women artists, although we had all been, at Art College, so we were all women artists, but it involved anybody else who was interested. And we just did it completely, as you were saying, outside of anything established. We sent pieces of work through the post to each other. Sometimes it was written on a postcard, sometimes it was made. It was done sort of between feeding the baby and, making the meals. And that's why the work is of the nature that it is. It's why it looks homemade a lot of the time, because it is. But all of the ideas behind it, were sort of, as you were saying, it was sort of common amongst women at the time. It was just starting to realise, that you weren't just Mrs. somebody or somebody's mum. That all of the freedoms that you got through going to college or university were going to be lost if you didn't do something about it. And so it was reclaiming the right, if you like, to, within a safe environment, make our views about our lives felt. And it did feel safe, and it felt very empowering, because so many common themes came about that after doing it, I can't remember for how long, but probably about 1 or 2 years, Kate and Monica and I and Phil decided that we would actually see if we would exhibit some of the work if women wanted to. Quite a lot of women didn't want to, and by that time we'd all got collections that people had sent to us and we might have responded to. People who wanted to exhibited it. Was completely anonymous, and we sort of toured it around from one place to another, ending up in the ICA, I think, in this country before it went to New Zealand. And in the ICA we built, I think it was at the time of the Silver Jubilee, I'm sure it was, but it was a very strange sort of atmosphere. But there was nobody around. But we got technicians to help us build some sort of rooms inside the gallery. And we made a living room and a kitchen and, just rooms that were a bit like our own houses, and put the work in there.
Yeah, there was a domestic scale all the time,
yes,
small
there was.
intimate, which was obvious why.
And all the things that were thematically together, sort of fitted well into that setup. Yeah.
Thank you. I think that again loops us back to the Arendt ideas and the space of appearance that has very much been threading through. I'm very conscious that there are I'm sure there are other questions and other comments from the audience, so I just want to open it back out quickly. Does anyone have anything they would like to ask, either individually or collectively, to our speakers and artists? Did I cut off too soon? Everyone's feeling very shy. No, there's a hand at the back.
I'm very conscious about the theme of erasure running through all of the talks today. And I recently was watching online Sarah Schulman doing a talk at SFU in Vancouver about the gentrification of AIDS and the erasure of ACT UP, working with the feminists and women's movements, and she was talking about that she'd recently been speaking to women AIDS activists in the States that had no idea, absolutely no idea of what ACT UP had done to make what they were doing possible. And I wondered if you wanted to speak a bit more about that together. I'm interested to hear a bit more about the erasure.
I think that's a great question, and today in the Common Guild there's a talk about Section 28, and it's really interesting that a guy, Ben I think his name is doing a film about Section 28, so it's partly to do with his ongoing film work, the discussion that's happening today. But Sue John, who's the other manager in the Women's Library, was the convener of the Stop the Section activism in Scotland. And Ben didn't know, this relates back to my thing about Scottish erasure. I'm sorry to say like half on about it, but it just so happens that he's somebody who's very deep into the research on Section 28 but didn't know that it had been repealed in Scotland and so on. So anyway, to your point, it's about AIDS and HIV activism. Sue John, who's speaking today, as I say, in Common Guild, did her research at the art school on Tessa Boffin. How many people know Tessa Boffin's work? So Tessa Boffin produced some of the most, I think, significant work around AIDS and HIV. It must have been sort of like 1990 or 1989, 1991. That I think is a really productive dialogue with the ACT UP material happening at the time. British, incredibly brave, brilliant, innovative photographer, but also curator, and she published a book called Stolen Glances, which was a survey of artists who were working on this topic. And the fact that in the room there's only a couple of people who know of her work, I think it's just unbelievable. I googled her actually last week just to see how she's faring in the old thing, but Stolen Glances and nothing there. You know, so this point that you've raised again about erasure, I think is, you know, we've got to be incredibly vigilant around this. You know, we've got to make new work, we've got to make work in every genre, we've got to sort of like be challenging and productively mining the sources, but we need also to ensure that the records are saved, conserved, but also made accessible in meaningful ways to everyone, you know, so they're not just for researchers and academics to sort of mull over or curators, but for the wider population to sort of like have a meaningful engagement with this material. But if we do anything, I think we'd go and have a look at Tessa Boffin's oeuvre, and in relation to your question, I think it's really important to look at it in relation to ACT UP as well.
Amelia.
I think it's a great question too, and of course the erasure can go both ways, but I think to take your point, there's a lot of artists who are not thought about and who have been erased, particularly from the kind of more dominant forms of feminism in the art world. And I think there are people like Leon Mostovoy, who used to be Tracy Mostovoy. So I'm really interested in the people who kind of go through some kind of transition and then, you know, they're trans male in this case, but are not considered feminist anymore, even though they consider themselves feminists. and queer men like Ron Athey, who have been feminists their entire career and have worked with queer feminists. And, you know, so I think it's a really important point, and I think it's those hybrid cases where the identification isn't quite so easy to stick to a kind of coalitional politics that actually are probably the most interesting, because they complicate the way we think about the politics of gender, sexuality, including artists who, of course, are insisting on issues of race and class. So I think that's where we should be thinking now. So thank you for that.
Did anyone else want to speak? Lynda, did you want to? I almost wanted to open that out as someone who has worked with other artists' archives and more general, maybe collective archives, and whether that's something that kind of is there in your thinking.
Maybe. So the question was?
Just how you as a practitioner are maybe thinking about issues of erasure or working against erasure, just to go back to the question, whether that's something that's active or...
I mean, there's always some woman somewhere waiting, or the ghost of some woman somewhere waiting very, very patiently for us to discover her archive. For the last 2 years, I've been very fascinated by the life of Athel Colquhoun, a British surrealist. But for every Athel Colquhoun, there are many, many more women's ghosts. And I do have that sense sometimes, this kind of queue of ghosts. And I think it's either we try to, as artists or art historians, we try and have sort of quite a wide remit of the ghosts that we befriend, or I suppose right now, for me, going in depth to the one archive of Athel Colquhoun, and hopefully sort of, as we kind of drag her back into the land of the living, then other women are sort of ushered in from the same period. But it will go on forever and ever, won't it? There's a lot of work still to be done, vast amounts of inquiry and research that have to happen.
Constant vigilance.
Yes, we can never sit back and say, that's it, work done. That will never happen in our lifetimes.
I think that's a very powerful kind of call to action, really, and that goes back to Adele's two keywords, vigilance and activism, I think, which are two very resonant concepts, I think. Any other points or questions?
Can I just share that Tessa Baldwin's archives are at the University of the Creative Arts in Canterbury, and you've just got to go there and try to, it's not that people don't want to make them accessible, it's just that, it's tragic that there's not more known about her. Or but just last week I had a researcher saying, do you know who Tessa Baldwin is? Kind of start an inquiry. But yes, those archives are there, and they're directly from her family. So it's an untapped resource, and it's finding, getting there, and pressurizing the gatekeepers to have access.
I just had something to add, just as a point of information, that since we're talking about undiscovered archives and archives that are languishing, that people should be aware of a project being currently run by DAX, the Designer and Artists Collecting Society, who started a 3-year program particularly looking at artists' archives and legacy. And legacy planning around archives. So you can see it on the website. They've started each year, there will be 100 artists in total whose archives are going to be assisted through the funding that has been raised by DAX.
It's a good reminder, yeah.
There's something very symbolic about
I know, we could just yell. I'm going to yell. Marina, don't yell.
Amelia. I was just thinking about the erasure and archives, and so I work with this feminist film distribution agency in London called Cinenova, and I guess the way we've been thinking about it as well is collaboration as a form of distribution and collaboration as a kind of campaign against erasure. So because, I mean, we haven't had any institutional funding since 2000, and it's kind of been run on a volunteer basis. But a few years ago, we kind of opened up our process of how we run the organization. There's maybe like 10 of us in different countries, like 5 of us concentrated in London. And a lot of the way we've kind of remained alive over the years is both in a way practically and conceptually is through collaboration with researchers, with other institutions, with independent and kind of desire-led projects as well as kind of formal projects. And I guess we've actually just become like way more public over the years. Now we do a regular screening because we've developed these relationships with spaces and with people. So I think, yeah, kind of collaboration as a sort of strategy against erasure.
I think that's a very nice note on which to end, actually. Oh, sorry. Okay, I think we've got one more.
Sorry, just a very quick comment. I must say I absolutely cringe when somebody says, oh, there's an unknown woman artist, you know, to be discovered. Having composed this litany for women artists, it's rather like the Blackadder scene where Ben Jonson he's completed his dictionary and he's got a great satisfied smile on his face, and then somebody creeps up and says, oh, I've just found a word, and can you add it? And it's like endless. So
your work is never going to be done. Our work is never going to be done. Collaborate, activate, activist, continue all of it. Be vigilant. People have been making frantic time symbols at me, so I'm sorry to kind of cut off the conversation there, but it feels like a productive note on which to end. Can we thank everyone, our artists, our keynotes who've joined us for this very reflective, very nuanced discussion. Thank you.